I was out for drinks last week with an old friend who's been thriving in the flex work world. He spent the first 20 minutes telling me how much he loved the autonomy. No boss, no 9 to 5, just him and his laptop at high-end cafes. He looked the part too. Sleek smartwatch, designer sneakers, and that specific kind of calm that comes with making it. He kept calling it total lifestyle design. But then his phone buzzed. Just a standard notification, nothing loud. Yet I watched his thumb hover over the screen, and for a split second, that polished exterior just evaporated. His shoulders tensed, and he performed this quick, nervous mental calculation that he thought I didn't notice. It wasn't a text from a client or a friend. It was a payment successful alert from a microloan app for a vacation he took 3 months ago. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. He didn't talk about freedom anymore. He started complaining about the algorithm and how he had to pick up 3 more quick tasks tonight just to keep his credit score from dipping. He went from being a digital nomad to sounding like someone staring at a ticking clock. What struck me wasn't that he was busy, but that he was exhausted by a system he claimed had liberated him. He had all the symbols of success, the gadgets, the flexibility, the agility, but he was effectively working to service his own past. No one was forcing him to stay at that table, and yet he was more trapped than anyone I know in a corporate office. It made me realize that the modern workplace hasn't done away with the chain. It just digitized it, wrapped it in a beautiful user interface, and convinced us that being economically cornered is actually just global efficiency. It's a new kind of dependency, one that doesn't need a guard at the door because the debt is already awake and waiting for you before your alarm even goes off.
Wow. That is a profoundly unsettling image, but it just captures something we were seeing across, almost every demographic in the data right now. You're describing the visible luxury of modern life clashing just violently with an invisible ledger.
The invisible ledger. It's the difference between the Instagram feed and the bank statement, right? And that moment with my friend, it really felt like the mask slipped. You know, we usually talk about wage slavery as this old-timey Dickensian concept.
Right, like something from the industrial era.
Yeah, but this felt different. It felt cleaner, quieter, but somehow, I don't know, more pervasive.
It is more pervasive. I think that's because it's been internalized. When you look at the material we've gathered for this discussion, it's everything from sociological texts on work to, central bank reports on quantitative easing and mental health. A pattern just jumps out.
And what's that pattern?
The alarm goes off at 5 a.m. Not because we're overflowing with passion to greet the day, but because, as one of the researchers puts it, there is no real alternative.
Oh, alternative.
The dependency has been engineered.
Right.
It's baked into the very infrastructure of daily life.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to sort of drag those invisible structures out into the light. We want to understand how employment or flex work or whatever you want to call it turned into this specific kind of dependence, because we're not just talking about being broke. This is different. We're talking about being trapped.
And we're going to look at this through, I think, 3 really distinct lenses.
Okay.
First, we have to look at the sociology of it. Why does this system make us feel so disconnected? So for that, we'll be looking at Emile Durkheim's concept of anomie.
Anomie.
Second, we'll get into the psychological toll and the rise of what's called the therapeutic state, which is where your financial stress is treated as a personal mental health issue rather than an economic one.
Ah, that's a big one.
And finally, we have to look at the engine room, the macroeconomics. We absolutely have to talk about quantitative easing and, why the housing ladder seems to have been pulled up into the stratosphere.
So it's the sociology, the psychology, and the economy all kind of wrapping around us at once.
Yeah.
Okay. To kick this off, I want to introduce a story that I think really sets the stage for this feeling of disconnection. This is about a guy, Julian.
Right. Let's hear about Julian.
So imagine a bright, ambitious architect in London. He followed every single rule of the meritocratic playbook, got the prestigious degree, did the grueling junior residency, and started that steady climb up the corporate ladder.
Checking all the boxes.
Checking all the boxes. Yet at 34, Julian finds himself staring at his banking app, and it feels more like a prison warden than a financial tool. I heard about his situation through a forum where professional, they vent about this invisible ceiling. Despite having what we'd call a middle-class salary, the cost of living and the compounding interest on his student loans mean he is perpetually 3 weeks away from insolvency.
Wow. Weeks.
And this financial precarity, it's curdled into a profound sense of, well, there's that word, Anomie. Julian no longer feels a sense of duty to a society that promised him stability in exchange for his brilliance.
The deal is off.
The deal is off. Instead, he feels like a high-functioning transient. And get this, when he looks at the gleaming skyscrapers he helps design, he doesn't see progress. He sees monuments to a system that harvested his potential and just left him with a digital ledger of debt.
So he's building the symbols of a world he can't participate in.
Exactly. And this isn't just about money, it's about the collapse of the social glue. When the best and brightest start to realize the game is rigged, the very fabric of social cohesion just starts to fray. It gets replaced by this cold, cynical distrust of every institution that once claimed to reward hard work.
That word you used, anomie, that is the absolute key to unlocking what Julian is feeling. It's a concept that goes all the way back to the 19th century sociologist Emil Durkheim, and it is just incredibly relevant right now.
I've heard the term before, but I'll be honest, I usually just equate it with something vague like sadness or alienation. But looking at the notes here, it seems way more technical than just, I'm sad about my job.
Oh, much more technical and, frankly, much more disturbing. If we look at the research on anomie and strain theory, Durkheim defines anomie not just as a mood, but as a state of normlessness.
Normlessness.
He used the French word dérèglement, and that translates to derangement or a lack of regulation.
Derangement, that feels aggressive. I mean, usually when we talk about regulation, we think about laws or rules being imposed on us, but you're saying a lack of regulation is the problem here.
In a sociological sense, yes.
Yeah.
Durkheim argued that a society functions because it regulates our expectations. It acts like a governor on an engine. It tells us if you do X, you can reasonably expect to get Y. It sets limits on our aspirations so that they are, achievable. Anomie occurs when that regulation breaks down.
When the if-then statement stops working.
It happens when society undergoes rapid change, economic, social, whatever, and the old rules just no longer apply. The norms become unclear.
So in a stable society, Julian knows that if he gets the fancy degree and works the 80-hour window,
He gets the house.
he gets the house and the security. The promise is fulfilled.
Exactly. His ambitions are, in a sense, restrained and directed by the collective order. But in a state of anomie, those aspirations are allowed to develop, and this is the key phrase, beyond the possibility of fulfillment.
The ceiling is removed, but the floor is also removed.
Durkheim actually studied this in the context of suicide rates in 19th century Europe. He found that periods of rapid social change, both economic booms and busts, actually led to higher rates of deviance and suicide because people just didn't know what to expect anymore. The rule book was gone.
That freedom from norms in that sense, but the goalposts keep moving.
And someone else is moving them. But there's another layer to this, specifically regarding his status as an architect, a member of the elite workforce.
Yeah.
We really need to talk about the meritocracy trap.
Okay, I found this concept fascinating because it completely flips the usual script. I mean, normally when we talk about inequality, we focus on the poor being exploited by the rich. But this research, particularly Daniel Markovitz's work, suggests that the elite people like Julian are structurally forced to exploit themselves. How does that even work?
It requires us to change how we view wealth and class. Think about the aristocracy of the past, let's say 18th century Europe. If you were elite, you owned land. You owned a factory.
You own things.
You owned things. You hired people to work for you. You had leisure. Your wealth worked for you. If you took a nap, your land was still there making you money.
Right, the landed gentry.
But today's elite, the top-tier lawyers, bankers, high-end architects like Julian, their primary wealth is their human capital.
It's their skill, their brain power. It's inside their head.
Exactly. So they can't just sit back. They have to constantly sell that brain power on the market.
Right. You can't rent out your brain for the afternoon while you go play golf.
To extract a return on that capital, they have to work with what Markovitz calls grinding intensity. The data shows they're working longer hours than the average worker. They are in what he calls a pitiless lifelong contest just to maintain their status.
It's like being on a treadmill that you built yourself, but you can't get off because if you stop running, you lose your spot in the class hierarchy and you fall.
Here. And it creates what Markovitz calls a ratchet effect.
The ratchet effect.
Yeah, because the education required to get these jobs is so expensive and so hyper-competitive, these elites have to work insanely hard to pay for their own education. And then they have to work even harder to afford the same or an even more elite level of education for their children just to keep them from falling behind.
Inequality in education leads to inequality in work,
which then requires you to buy even more expensive education for the next generation.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of anxiety.
It is a cycle that creates a wealthy but miserable caste of people. They might have the money, but they have no time, and they are constantly deeply terrified of slipping.
This connects back to another sociologist we have in the notes here, Robert Merton. He took Durkheim's idea of anomie and he applied it to the American dream, right?
It's a really important extension of the idea. Merton developed what's called strain theory.
Strain theory.
He argued that the problem in America, and by extension the modern West, is that we have these incredibly strong cultural goals. We are all taught from birth to want wealth, success, the corner office.
The winner takes it all. It's baked into everything.
Right. But, and this is the crucial part, the legitimate means to get there, things like education, hard work, saving your money, those are structurally blocked or just insufficient for a huge number of people.
So the goal is get rich, but the prescribed method is work a job that pays less than the cost of rent.
Exactly. That gap, that chasm between the cultural goal and the available means creates what Merton called strain.
Okay.
When the social structure eliminates access to success via those legitimate means, people crack.
Merton outlined a few different ways people adapt to this, and Julian, he represents the conformist.
The conformist, he did everything he was supposed to do. He followed the rules. He used the legitimate means, he got the degree, he worked the hours, but he didn't get the reward. The system failed him.
And that's why he's cynical. If he had broken the rules and failed, he'd blame himself. But he followed the rules and still failed, so he blames the system.
And that breakdown of trust is so sociologically dangerous. When the conformists stop believing, the social contract essentially dissolves. There's nothing holding it together anymore.
It's interesting you mentioned trust because that leads us directly into our next story. If Julian is the architect looking at the structural failure of the building, this next story is about someone trying to live inside it while the walls are closing in.
Okay.
Let's talk about Elena.
This shifts us from the sociological to the psychological.
I saw a video recently about a young woman in New York named Elena. She's a marketing specialist, and she was struggling to keep up with her credit card payments. But what struck me, what I couldn't get out of my head, wasn't her debt. It was how she was being taught to handle it. Her employer provided a financial wellness app as a perk, you know, one of those slick neon-colored interfaces. And it offered guided meditations for spending anxiety and digital badges for budgeting mindfulness.
Wow.
Just try to imagine the psychological toll of that. The structural reality of her stagnant wages, which hadn't moved an inch despite her promotions, was being completely reframed as a personal mental health crisis.
It's her fault.
It's her fault. The therapeutic state told Elena that if she felt crushed, it was because she lacked financial resilience, not because the cost of her existence had been aggressively financialized. By pathologizing her economic struggle into a moral or psychological failure, the system successfully diverted her anger away from macroeconomic policy and toward her own reflection in the mirror. It makes you realize how fintech doesn't just manage your money, it manages your dissent. As a content creator who watches these trends, I find it so deeply unsettling how we've replaced systemic accountability with self-care checklists. We've effectively silenced the collective cry for fair wages with a whisper to breathe through the debt.
Breathe through the debt. It perfectly encapsulates what scholars call the therapeutic state model.
What is the therapeutic state? It sounds like something straight out of a dystopian novel.
It's very real. We have some research here on the bottlenecks in financial well-being that critiques this exact phenomenon. The therapeutic state is a system where broad social and economic problems are reframed as individual psychological pathologies.
So it's a diagnostic tool for social control.
In a way, instead of fixing the environment, the economy, the policies, the system focuses on fixing the individual's reaction to that environment.
So instead of saying rent is too high because of decades of bad housing policy, the system says you are anxious about rent because you lack mindfulness and budgeting skills.
That is it, precisely. It shifts the site of the problem from the market to the mind. If you are struggling, it's not because wages have been stagnant since the 1970s adjusted for inflation. No, it's because you have spending anxiety or you lack financial literacy.
It's basically gaslighting on an industrial scale. It forces you to internalize a massive structural failure as your own personal shortcoming.
And this connects to something called institutional anomie theory, which builds on what we were just discussing. The argument here is that economic values, efficiency, competition, profit have penetrated non-economic institutions.
What do you mean by non-economic institutions?
I mean things like the family, the school system, and even our own concept of self-worth. This is what's called market mentality.
So we start treating ourselves and our lives like a business that needs to turn a profit.
Yes. We start to view our self-worth through a profit and loss statement. And this marketized mentality leads to what the researchers call normative flexibility.
Dang.
A fancy way of saying people start doing whatever it takes to survive or get ahead because the only metric that matters anymore is the bottom line. It also leads to a devaluation of vulnerable groups. If you aren't profitable in the market sense, you aren't valuable as a person.
And you see this market mentality starting incredibly early. I want to bring in the student as consumer narrative here. Alina didn't just wake up in debt one day. She was likely groomed for it starting at age 18 when she applied for college.
There's significant legal and sociological scholarship that has tracked this shift in how we view higher education. Historically, the narrative was about civic or social benefit.
Right, you educate people so they become good citizens, which helps everyone in society.
But over the past few decades, that has been almost entirely replaced by the return on investment or ROI narrative.
Education is just a product you buy. It's a transaction designed to increase your future earnings.
Correct. And this creates the student consumer. And what do you do with consumers? You market to them. Universities start acting like service providers, competing for business.
Yeah.
The reports talk about the club ed phenomenon. Schools spending millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, on lazy rivers, rock climbing walls, and luxury dorms to attract these student consumers.
I remember seeing those college brochures when I was in high school. Come here, we have a sushi bar in the cafeteria. It looked more like a resort than a university.
But that money has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
It comes from tuition hikes, which are passed on to students in the form of loans. So you have teenagers making what they think are market choices based on amenities. I want the school with the lazy river, without realizing they are taking on debt that functionally cripples their future. Right?
There was a specific statistic about credit scores that really blew my mind.
Agreeing. In 2003, a 30-year-old with student debt generally had a better credit score than someone without debt.
Why was that?
Because the degree paid off. It signaled higher earning potential, and the debt was manageable. It was seen as a good investment. By 2012, that had completely flipped.
Fertile.
The debt burden had become so high that a 30-year-old with a degree now had a lower credit score, on average, than someone who didn't go to college at all.
The investment is becoming a liability on your credit report. And this brings us back full circle to this concept of the financialization of daily life.
This is the mechanism that keeps Elena trapped. The literature we looked at calls it the locking loop.
The locking loop.
It starts with low wages.
Okay.
That leads to zero savings. Zero savings means you have to rely on credit for any emergency.
The car breaks down, the kid gets sick. You have to use the card. There's no choice.
Right. And once you have that high-interest debt, you develop a deep fear of job loss. That fear weakens your bargaining power at work. You can't ask for a raise, you can't push back, and you certainly can't quit because you have those payments to make every single month.
It's a perfect trap, and technology just accelerates this, right? It's not just credit cards anymore. It's buy now, pay later for a pair of jeans. It's microloans for a grocery bill. It's gamified finance apps with little rewards.
It wraps the chain in a beautiful user experience. It feels like a service, smooth UX, calming colors.
Yeah.
But its core function is to facilitate and normalize dependency on debt.
And there's that quote from the anthropologist David Graeber that fits perfectly here, the one about the morality of debt.
Debt is a moral obligation. That is the deep psychological trap. We are taught from childhood that paying your debts is the ultimate sign of morality and good character. So if you can't pay, you don't just feel broke, you feel like a bad person.
You feel shame.
You feel shame. And this keeps people like Elena compliant. They internalize the failure. They don't riot. They download the mindfulness app.
So we have Julian, who sees the social contract breaking down around him. We have Elena, who is being told to meditate away her structural debt. But now I want to zoom out. We need to look at the engine that is driving all this asset inflation and making life so impossibly expensive in the first place.
The macro engine.
Right. Story in Australia.
Okay.
I came across this story about a family in Sydney where the generational divide has become a literal physical wall. The parents bought their modest home in the 90s for what now seems like a pittance. Their son, who is a teacher, has done the math and realizes he will likely never own a home in his own city unless he inherits theirs.
The only way in is to wait for them to die.
This is the Goldman Sachs version of a family tree. It's a structural trap where post-2008 quantitative easing pumps so much cheap money into assets that the younger generation has been completely priced out of their own lives. We talk about the American dream or the global meritocracy, but for someone like this teacher, those are just ghost stories. He is forced into a life of debt-driven dependency, paying a huge portion of his income to run a property owned by someone of his parents' generation who just happened to benefit from a defunct economic era.
The meritocratic promise has collapsed.
It has functionally collapsed. It's hard not to feel a sense of mourning when you read these accounts. And while the rhetoric of personal responsibility is so often used to justify these outcomes, usually by those who climbed the ladder before it was pulled up, we have to acknowledge the sheer weight of these perverse incentive structures.
Right.
Understanding the frustration of a generation trapped in this cycle of modern wage slavery doesn't mean we abandon the value of hard work, but it does mean we have to admit that for many, many people, the ladder is no longer touching the ground.
That image, the ladder no longer touching the ground, is the perfect visualization of the real-world consequences of quantitative easing, or QE.
Yes. We hear QE thrown around all the time in financial news. The Fed is printing money. But what is it actually doing? I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of nod along without really understanding the mechanics. We've got a UK Parliament report here that breaks it down. Can you walk us through the actual transaction?
Let's demystify it. It's actually not as complicated as it sounds. Quantitative easing is when a central bank, like the Bank of England in the UK or the Federal Reserve in the US, creates new money electronically.
So they're not literally printing physical bills?
They just add zeros to their own account on a computer. Then they use that newly created money to buy government bonds and other assets from private investors. These are big players like pension funds or insurance companies.
There. The central bank creates money from thin air, and they use it to buy a bond from a pension fund. So now the pension fund has a huge pile of cash. What happens to that cash?
That is the critical moment. This is the part that affects all of us. It's a process called portfolio rebalancing.
Portfolio rebalancing.
The investors, the pension funds, they don't just sit on that pile of cash. They need to earn a return. So they take that cash and they go buy other assets, usually riskier ones like corporate stocks or, crucially for this story, property.
Okay, so this massive injection of cash doesn't go into building new factories or raising wages. It goes straight into the asset markets.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The stated goal of QE is to lower interest rates and encourage spending in the real economy. But one of the primary transmission mechanisms, that's the technical term for the way it's supposed to work, is through something called the wealth effect. The theory is, if asset prices go up, the people who own those assets will feel richer. And because they feel richer, they'll spend more money, and that will stimulate the economy for everyone.
But wait, I mean, that logic seems fundamentally flawed if you don't own any assets to begin with.
That's the problem.
If you're the Sydney teacher, you don't feel richer because the stock market is up. You just see the price of the house you wanted to buy suddenly skyrocket out of reach.
And that is the distributive tragedy of QE. The UK Parliament report is very, very clear on this. It says the policy has inflated asset prices artificially. And this has, and I'm quoting, benefited those who own them disproportionately.
Is there any data on how disproportionate that benefit was?
Yes. The report estimated that for the richest 10% of households in the UK, the benefit of QE was around £350,000 per household.
Wow.
And for the poorest households, negligible, maybe a few £100s, if that, because the poor don't own bonds or stock portfolios or surplus real estate. They rely on wages.
This connects directly to the Matthew effect that was mentioned in one of the other sources we have, the one about the 2008 recession.
The Matthew effect, right. It comes from the biblical verse in the Gospel of Matthew, "To he who has much more is given." In sociology and economics, it refers to the concept of cumulative advantage.
The rich get richer.
In this context, it means if you had assets before 2008, QE acted like a rocket booster for your personal wealth. If you were young and rolled on a salary, you were left on the launch pad.
So we have this asset inflation trap. QE stabilized the banks after the financial crisis, which was the goal. But as an unintended consequence, it completely detached the cost of housing from local wages.
It created what economists now call a K-shaped recovery.
A K-shaped recovery. Can you draw that picture for us?
Yeah, imagine the letter K. The vertical line is the moment of the crisis in 2008. Then two lines diverge. The top line goes sharply up. That's financial assets. That's the stock market, property values, the wealth of the asset holders.
And the bottom line?
The bottom line goes down or stays flat. That's employment income, the service sector, the renters, the young people.
And this creates that generational wall we see in the Sydney story. The boomers and a lot of Gen X, generally speaking, were on the top line of the K because they already owned assets, they bought their homes earlier.
Right.
And the millennials and Gen Z are on the bottom line of the K.
And this explains the teacher situation perfectly. His human capital, his labor as a teacher, his salary, it cannot possibly compete with the returns on financial capital that his parents' generation is enjoying. He can work as hard as he wants, but he can't outsave an asset market that is being artificially inflated by central bank liquidity.
It really contextualizes the resentment we see online sometimes. It's not just kids these days don't want to work. It's that the work doesn't buy what it used to.
It fundamentally breaks the meritocratic promise.
Yeah.
If the return on having money is consistently higher than the return on earning money through labor, then social mobility grinds to a halt.
Yes. We have the breakdown of the social contract, the feeling that the rules no longer apply. That's the enemy.
Yes.
We have the pathologizing of the individual, the idea that your debt is a personal failure. That's the therapeutic state.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the rigging of the macroeconomy through quantitative easing, which privileges assets over labor.
The sociological, the psychological, and the economic all converging.
And the result of all this, I think, has to be a deep crisis of self-worth. If you can't have the things that our society tells you signal success, then who are you? What's your value?
That is the deep philosophical question posed by the CONY paper in our sources, the one titled, From Having to Being.
Right. Talk to me about the neoliberal script they describe.
The paper argues that for the last 40 years or so, we've all been operating under a neoliberal script of self-worth. This script tells us that your value as a human being is fundamentally tied to your material success, your competitiveness, and your self-reliance.
And the rugged individualist, I am what I own, or maybe I am what I earn.
Exactly. And because inequality is growing so rapidly, this script is causing a massive mental health crisis. And not just for the poor, but for the upper middle class too. The paper talks about the fear of falling.
The parents who are terrified their kids won't get into the right Ivy League school.
Helicopter parenting, the application frenzy. This is all driven by a deep existential anxiety. Even the people who are winning the game are terrified of losing their spot for their children. This leads to what scientists call a high allostatic load, which is just the physical wear and tear on the body caused by chronic stress.
So the system is making the poor desperate and the rich anxious. Nobody is at peace.
It's creating a society of high cortisol levels. The paper does propose a solution, but it's a really difficult one. It suggests we need to shift our cultural membership away from valuing people based on their resources and toward being.
So valuing people based on their relationships, their moral qualities, their character, their experiences.
It also sounds trite, like something from a motivational poster. But think about how incredibly hard that is to do when the market mentality is so dominant. How do you value being when your rent requires having?
It feels like asking someone to meditate while their house is on fire. You can't just think your way out of it.
Yes. But the argument is that we need to start somewhere. We need to broaden the cultural criteria of what a successful life looks like. We need new narratives of hope that aren't based on consumption. If we don't, we're just going to keep running on this meritocratic treadmill until we collectively collapse.
This has been, it's heavy, but it's so necessary. Let's just look back at where we started. We began with my friend in the cafe looking like a master of the universe, but secretly terrified of a microloan notification.
Yeah.
We traced that single moment of fear all the way back to Durkheim's sociology. The idea that without clear, fair norms, we are lost. We looked at how the therapeutic state tries to fix our minds instead of fixing the market. And we saw how the central banks, in an effort to save the system, effectively built a wall between those who own assets and those who work for wages.
It is a sobering picture, but I think acknowledging the invisible ledger is the first step to not being completely controlled by it.
The flexibility of the modern world really is a mask, isn't it? We talk about agility and freedom and being your own boss, but for so many people, it's just a rigid, debt-driven dependency with better branding.
It is the efficiency trap. The system is incredibly efficient for balance sheets. It extracts maximum value from human capital. But it is profoundly exhausting for human bodies and human spirits.
So what do we leave the listener with? Where do we go from here?
I want to go back to the discussion we had on human X tech one last time. We often blame the robots or the apps or the hustle culture. But the problem isn't the technology itself.
It's the design of the system it's used in.
The final provocation from the research is this. The real question we need to ask ourselves and the institutions we interact with is not, is this efficient? But rather, efficient for whom and exhausting for whom? Perhaps the task today is not to build faster, more efficient systems, but to reopen space for human choice inside these massive structures that quietly, almost invisibly remove it. Because work should sustain life, not make us afraid to pause.